Alien Forge Master called it impossible steel, humans smiled. Damascus, my dad makes them on weekends. The sky above the geode ridges didn't rain water, it shed arcs of purple static that left the taste of tin on the tongue. Gavin Vance stepped off the shuttle ramp, his leather boots making a dull thud against the glass platform. Behind him, 3 Terran diplomats checked the charge meters on their handheld computers. Gavin didn't look at the meters. He adjusted the collar of his denim jacket, feeling the familiar grease smudge against his jawline. The air smelled like electrical fire and old copper pennies. A line of 6-armed metalworkers stood along the walkway. Their silver aprons didn't move in the thin wind. Gavin watched the third smith from the left. The creature had 3 fingers on its lower right hand, but the middle claw was shorter, ground down to a blunt nub from some old mishap with a grinding wheel. That was the wrong detail. In a facility that tracked precision down to the width of an atom, a mismatched finger didn't fit. Gavin kept his hand inside his pocket, his fingers resting against the notched handle of his old iron screwdriver. "The registry is waiting," Dr. Salana whispered from behind his shoulder. She was tapping her display screen, her fingers moving fast. "Master Silex doesn't like to wait for the observational group. We have 12 minutes before the primary fusion cycle starts." Gavin didn't quicken his pace. He knew about the 12 minutes. He also knew the video titles back home were already calling this place the high seat of the impossible forge, where alien masters claimed human steel was nothing but a primitive lie. The galaxy had spent 3 months waiting to see if a man from a Minnesota backyard could handle the heat. They reached the end of the glass walkway where the floor dropped off into a deep, round pit. Suspended in the middle of the empty space was a single block of dark metal. It floated without chains, held steady by 3 thin rings of blue light that hummed like an angry hornet. The metal door-sized sheet rippled like pond water under a breeze, even though it was solid. Master Kalen Silex stood on the edge of the pit. He was 7 feet tall, his gray chitinous shoulders broad beneath a heavy mantle made of woven alloy fibers. A mask shaped like a flat anvil crest hid his faceplates, but the cerulean veins in his secondary arms glowed bright against the dark geode walls. He raised his upper right arm, pointing a long finger at the floating sheet. "This is the limit of your understanding," Silex said. His voice came through the translator box with 3 distinct tones like notes played on a broken pipe organ. "Forged under the weight of 3 star collapses, cooled in neutron brine, shaped by fields that do not allow a single atom to sit out of place. It survives the heat of a sun, it does not decay." Gavin walked to the very edge of the stone ledge. He looked down into the dark pit, then back at the rippling metal. The blue light from the rings reflected off his oily jacket buttons. "Looks like Damascus," Gavin said. The organ tones from the translator cut off. The 6-armed smiths along the wall went entirely still. Dr. Salana stopped tapping her screen, her thumb frozen mid-stroke. Silex turned his massive anvil mask toward Gavin, the blue veins in his lower arms darkening to the color of bruised plums. "Would you have stayed in that room, or would you have turned back to the ship?" "Stay close, because the real test was about to land on the table." Gavin pulled his hands out of his pockets and sat down on a stone equipment crate. The time marker on his wristpad showed the transport line back to Earth was stabilizing its orbital link. The transition from the high geode arches to the low, flat landscape of the Earth subzone always made his ears pop. 2 hours later, Gavin was sitting in the corner of the staff lounge, using the flat head of his iron screwdriver to pry open the plastic lid of an old greased tin. The human scientists were still in the main hall, arguing with the scribe nodes about lattice density graphs. "He called it an archaic insult," Dr. Salana said as she walked into the lounge. She dropped a stack of printed data sheets onto the metal table. The paper slid across the top, stopping against Gavin's lunch sack. "Silex wants a physical demonstration. He logged a formal demand with the embassy. He thinks we're running a trick with our orbital freight records." "My dad doesn't run tricks," Gavin said. He wiped the tip of the screwdriver on his pants. "He just doesn't use a 0-point computer to tell him when the iron is hot." "They don't have a word for backyard," Salana said. She sat down, her knuckles knocking against the table. The translator kept turning it into unregulated regional landfill. "Silex thinks your father is a government specialist working in a secret vault." Gavin took a bite of his bread. The peanut butter was dry, sticking to the roof of his mouth. He thought about the workshop back home, with the yellow pine mulch rotting by the fence and the old blue tarp leaking rain onto the scrap pile. There wasn't any secret vault. There was just an old man with a bad hip and 3 shelves of rusted files. The door to the lounge chimed and Scribe Node 9 stepped through the opening. The alien's chitinous legs made a sharp clicking sound on the rubber floor mat. It didn't have an anvil mask like Silex, but its face plates were pulled tight, the small breathing vents near its neck whistling with every exhale. "The High Master has adjusted the diagnostic array," Node 9 said. The translator voice was flat, devoid of the layered tones. "The human transit box has cleared the orbital gate. It is currently clearing the atmospheric heat shield." Gavin stood up, tucking the screwdriver into his belt loop. "Let's go watch him scan it then." The secondary testing room was smaller than the geode hall, smelled of ozone and the damp lime flavor of recycled air. Silex was already there, his upper limbs folded across his chest mantle while his lower hands adjusted the silver dials on a three-legged camera system. The camera pointed down at a heavy stone slab. A human transport case sat on the floor. It was made of dented aluminum, the corners reinforced with black plastic that had split during some old flight through Chicago. A single strip of gray duct tape held the latches down. Gavin knelt by the box. The adhesive on the tape had dried out, coming away with a dry hiss that sounded like sand sliding down a metal chute. He reached inside, pulling away an old kitchen towel that smelled of fried onions and kerosene. Nested in the cloth was a plain chef's knife. The blade was 8 inches long, the steel dark and lined with swirling gray patterns that looked like smoke frozen inside glass. The wooden handle was held together by 2 small brass pins, one of them slightly crooked where the drill bit had slipped 40 years ago. Silex didn't touch the knife. He used a pair of long silver tongs to lift it by the wooden grip, placing it under the lens of the three-legged diagnostic array. "We will look at the lattice now," Silex said, his anvil mask tilted down. "If there are no energy fields inside the grain, the scanner will register a total structural void. Your lie will have a number." The blue light from the array hit the smoke-patterned steel. Gavin leaned against the concrete wall, his boots crossed at the ankle. He could hear the cooling fans in the camera starting to whine, their pitch rising from a low growl to a sharp, metallic scream. The display screen on the wall didn't show numbers. It showed a series of bright white lines that began to twist around each other like vines. The automated tracking system clicked twice, trying to find a flat baseline in the carbon grain, but the lines kept stacking, growing thicker and faster until the green status light on the console turned a deep, solid black. A sharp pop echoed through the small room. A thin ribbon of white smoke drifted out of the camera's lower vent, smelling of scorched copper and melted plastic. The white lines on the screen vanished, replaced by a single row of error characters that didn't have a translation code. Node 9 stepped backward, its middle claws striking the tool rack with a loud jangle of wrenches. The alien's breathing vents stopped whistling entirely. Silex lowered the tongs. He looked at the smoking camera, then at the knife, then at Gavin. The cerulean veins in his arms were perfectly still, the light inside them dimming until they looked like cold ash. "The sensor did not complete the loop," Silex said. His voice was lower now, the organ tones separated and rough. "The density does not have a calculation. What field generator did your father use to lock these layers?" Gavin reached out and picked up the knife from the stone slab, his bare thumb checking the back spine for burrs. "An old charcoal bin," Gavin said, "and an anvil we bought from a guy named Frank." Silex didn't move his mask for a long time. The silence in the testing room grew long, heavy with the smell of the dead camera circuitry. Across the room, Node 9 was still holding its middle limbs against its sides, its face plates vibrating in short, silent bursts. "I have 300 years of lineage in the high geode," Silex said, his anvil mask rising slowly until he looked directly at the denim collar of Gavin's jacket. "There is no record of iron settling into this shape without a wave guide. Your father's station must be examined." "He's not at a station," Gavin said, wrapping the knife back in the onion-scented towel. "He's usually on the back porch by 5. The registry terminal on the wall hummed, its backup power cell kicking in with a soft click. Gavin watched the screen clear its error codes, the empty lines waiting for a text entry that nobody in the room knew how to type. The formal document from the High Skydome Consortium arrived via the diplomatic carrier on a Tuesday. It did not carry a seal of trade or a standard transport directive. It bore a single deep impression pressed directly into the synthetic parchment by Vrithrak Master's primary claw. The translation text beneath the mark was short. Master Kalen Silex had registered for a terrestrial entry visa, listing his purpose as an unscientific inspection of a primitive heat tanker. Gavin Vance did not look up from the vice bench when the notification pinged on his display slate. He was using a flat mill file to clean the shoulder of a small utility tang, the iron filings falling in a silent gray heap onto the dirt floor of the Minnesota shed. The air inside the workshop was cold, holding the heavy smell of old kerosene and damp pine needles that had rotted against the foundation boards over the winter. "He's at the regional gate in Chicago," Dr. Solana's voice said through the workbench receiver. The connection was clear, though the background hum of the Orbital Customs terminal was loud. They had to hire an open-bed flatbed truck from a salvage yard just to fit his equipment case. Gavin, he didn't clear his secondary mantle through the biological scanner. He told the Port Authority that the fibers were part of his skeletal alignment. "Tell him the road from the highway is mostly mud this week," Gavin said, his file moving in short, even strokes that made a rhythmic clack shhh against the iron. "If the truck gets stuck by the creek, he'll have to walk the last mile." The flatbed arrived just before noon, its diesel engine groaning as the rear tires churned through the gray ruts by the mailbox. Silex did not use the folding steps to descend from the truck bed. He stepped directly over the wooden sideboards, his leather-soled boots sinking 3 inches into the wet mulch. He wore an insulated canvas travel cloak over his chitinous shoulder plates, but his anvil-shaped mask was missing, replaced by 3 silver breathing tubes that ran from his neck vents to a small tank strapped to his secondary waist. Mike Vance did not leave his lawn chair when the shadow of the 7-foot Vrithrak crossed the threshold of the porch. He was holding a chipped ceramic mug of cold black coffee, his thumb rubbing a small notch in the rim. His old flannel shirt was torn at the elbow, revealing a patch of white hair and a deep scar from a grinding disc accident 30 years ago in Duluth. "You're big," Mike said, his voice rough from 40 years of charcoal smoke. He didn't offer a hand. He pointed the base of his coffee mug toward the corner of the shed where 3 old push brooms leaned against an oil drum. "The floors got 2 months of scale from the trip hammer. Start by sweeping the corners." Silex stood perfectly still under the low rafters, his upper limbs nearly touching the pine beams. The silver breathing tubes near his throat clicked twice as the internal valves adjusted to the smell of sulfur and charcoal. His secondary claws flexed, his fingers reaching instinctively for the non-existent interface dials of his geode console. "This space does not have a thermal regulator," Silex said, the translator box on his belt emitting its rough, unlayered organ tones. "The ambient moisture is currently 3 times above the permitted baseline for iron preservation. The iron will decay before the fold completes." "It won't decay if you keep moving," Mike said, setting his mug on the floorboards. "The broom's in the corner." The High Master did not touch the wooden handle with his primary hands. He used his lower limbs, his 3-fingered claws gripping the splintered ash wood backward. On his first pass across the dirt floor, his upper left shoulder plate struck a low shelf of iron bar stock, sending 6 lengths of high-carbon rail spikes jangling into the dirt. The sound was loud, sharp, shattering the quiet rhythm of the afternoon. Gavin didn't stop filing. He didn't look up to see the high smith of the high consortium fumble with the wooden handle as he tried to clear the debris. Silex's lower claws were designed for the glass-smooth triggers of a quantum forge. They had no traction against the rough grain of Minnesota ash wood. By the 3rd hour, the hem of his gray travel cloak was black with grease, and a thin layer of fine charcoal dust had settled over his cerulean arm veins, turning the bright blue glow into a dim, purple shadow. "The air is thick with unfiltered carbon particulates," Silex rasped, his breathing vents widening until the silver tubes vibrated against his neck armor. "The intake is not certified for biological survival." "That's just coal dust," Gavin said, setting his file down to check the time on his wrist pad. It was 4 o'clock. "The air gets clearer once the fire gets hot. Go help Dad with the blower." The midpoint of the week brought the rain, a heavy, freezing downpour that turned the gravel yard into a gray soup. Inside the shed, the small charcoal forge was roaring, its air blast supplied by an old green leaf blower that Mike had bolted to a steel pipe with 3 hose clamps. The noise was a steady, deafening whine that forced Silex to lean his massive head close to the hearth just to see the color of the metal. "It is yellow," Silex said, his upper left hand pointing a silver measuring stylus at the glowing square of iron nestled in the coals. "The digital metric registers 900 degrees. the lattice is ready for the compression wave. It's not yellow, Mike barked from behind the anvil. He wasn't using a meter. He squinted through his polarized spectacles, his bare fingers touching the cold spine of the tongs. It's lemon skin. If you hit it now, the center's going to slide right out from under the skin. Wait until the dark spots around the corners turn the color of an old brick. Silex adjusted his silver stylus, his lower limbs shifting his weight on the muddy dirt. The predictive calculation indicates the carbon will migrate if the heat stays at this level for 40 seconds more. Your calculations don't know about the dampness in the air coming out of that leaf blower, Mike said, gripping the long handles of the heavy forging tongs. He pulled the white-hot block of iron from the coals and dropped it onto the steel face of the anvil. Hit it here, hard, don't think about the numbers, listen to the jingle. The Vrithrak lifted the 12-pound sledgehammer with 3 limbs, his muscles tensing beneath his chitinous skin until his veins flared bright blue under the charcoal dust. He brought the steel face down with massive force, but his angle was off by 3 degrees. A sharp, explosive crack filled the small workspace. A piece of the high-carbon rail spike broke free from the main billet, whistling past Gavin's ear before burying itself 2 inches deep into the soft pine wall of the woodshed. The rest of the block sat on the anvil, split down the middle like an overripe log, its glowing orange interior cooling down to a dull, dead gray within seconds. Silex dropped the hammer. His lower limbs flared outward in frustration, his secondary claws striking the tool rack until 3 pairs of tongs jangled onto the floor. His breathing vents were wide, discharging short, hot bursts of steam that smelled of scorched plasma tonic. The material has a hidden flaw, Silex growled, his translator voice dropping into a single, grating pitch that sounded like stones grinding inside an iron cylinder. The alignment was correct. The pressure was within the variance. The iron lied. Gavin didn't look up from his vise. He reached into his belt loop, pulled out the old iron screwdriver and walked over to the anvil. He used the flat head of the tool to scrape a thick layer of black scale away from the anvil's face, his movements slow and unhurried. The iron didn't lie, Gavin said, tossing the scraped scale into the water bucket where it died with a brief, angry hiss. You didn't wait for the heat to reach the core, you rushed the cool phase because you were watching your stylus instead of watching the shadow move across the weld. Silex stepped back, his massive gray shoulders slouched until his cloak touched the muddy floorboards. His 4 eyes blinked out of sync, staring at the split block of gray iron like it was an unrecognized language. The technocratic certainty that had built the High Consortium's eternal core had no code for a failure that didn't show up on a display screen. I have tracked 3,000 cycles in the geode, Silex said, his voice dropping until it was barely a murmur beneath the steady drone of the rain outside. The metal always follows the wave guide. There aren't any wave guides here, Mike said, reaching for his coffee mug. Just a hammer and a piece of dirt. Pick up that split piece. We're starting over. The High Master didn't reach for his stylus. He dropped his lower hands into his lap, his chitinous fingers covered in a mixture of black scale and gray Minnesota mud. He looked at the old iron screwdriver in Gavin's belt, then at the low, flickering coals of the hearth, his breathing vents completely silent for 11 seconds as the cold rain began to leak through the blue tarp overhead, dropping single, measured spots of water onto the dead iron. The next billet didn't come from the scrap heap, it came from the bottom of Silex's heavy travel chest, wrapped in a magnetic cloth that hummed when the ties were cut. The metal was dull, pockmarked with green crystals from a deep impact crater back in his home system. Silex laid it on the wooden bench with his primary hands, his chitinous shoulders squared as he looked at Mike. We mix them, Silex said, the translator box on his belt spitting out its single-pitch grate. Your high-carbon spike, my crater stone, we forge them without the alignment field or we do not finish the contract. Mike didn't answer right away. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a plug of dark tobacco and used his thumb to push it into his cheek. He looked at the green-speckled stone, then at the old iron screwdriver tucked into Gavin's belt. The stone's got sulfur in it, Mike said, his voice flat. If we hit it too cold, the whole thing will blow apart like a glass bottle. If we hit it too hot, it'll turn into slag and ruin the hearth. Gavin, go get the borax from the laundry room. By midnight, the storm had worsened, the wind ripping a corner of the blue tarp away from the rafters with a sound like a rifle shot. The leaf blower whined at full speed, forcing the air into the shared intake of the new twin hearth they had spent 3 days building out of old pizza parlor bricks. The coals were a deep, blinding white, throwing long shadows across the grease-covered walls of the shed. Silex handled the long tongs now. His lower limbs were clamped around his waist belt to keep them clear of the flying sparks, while his primary arms held the heavy iron handles with a grip that left deep indentations in the metal. He didn't look at his silver stylus anymore. His 4 eyes were fixed on the center of the fire, watching the way the green crystals in the crater stone began to melt, turning into tiny rivers of emerald fluid that ran between the gray layers of the rail spike. "The color is changing," Silex rasped, his neck vents widening to let out a cloud of gray steam. "It is past the shade of brick. It is turning the color of a late sun over the geode." "Not yet," Gavin shouted over the drone of the blower. He was standing by the anvil, his palms calloused and black with scale. "Wait for the sweat. When the borax starts to bubble on the edges like boiling grease, that's when the layers are talking to each other." Silex waited. The silver breathing tubes near his throat clicked 3 times in the dark, the rhythm matching the steady drop of rain through the split roof. Then, with a short grunt that came through the translator as a sharp jangle of bells, he pulled the combined block from the coals and dropped it onto the anvil. Mike struck first. His handhammer was small, 3 pounds of pitted steel, but every blow landed in the exact center of the weld with a clear, high-pitched ping. Then Silex brought the 12-pound sledge down right behind him, his upper limbs moving in a wide, heavy arc that shook the dirt floor beneath Gavin's boots. The metal didn't split this time. The green veins from the crater stone flattened out, spreading thin across the high-carbon steel like grease on a hot griddle. With every turn of the billet, the 2 materials sank deeper into each other, creating a strange, swirling grain that seemed to shift under the red light of the forge. By the 4th month, the yellow leaves had all fallen into the mud by the porch, and the High Master of the High Consortium could start the twin hearth without using a single digital sensor. He still wore his canvas apron backward because the straps didn't clear his secondary armor plates, but his movements had lost their clumsy hesitation. When a tool fell from the rack, he didn't stare at it. His lower left claw caught it before it hit the dirt, sliding it back into the loop without his eyes ever leaving the anvil. "The embassy is asking for the report," Dr. Solana said, her voice coming through the handheld unit as she walked into the yard. She was wearing knee-high rubber boots, her face pale under her plastic hood. "Silex, the High Skydome Consortium has reclassified your observation period as an unauthorized leave of absence. They've sent a second node to log the state of your geode house." Silex didn't look up from his work. He was using a short chisel to clear a thick ridge of scale from the blade's full tang, his lower hands holding the block steady while his upper right hand delivered short, precise taps with a wooden mallet. "Tell the registry that the house can wait," Silex said, his organ tones rough and steady. "The alignment is not finished here. The grain has 3 more folds before it settles." "They aren't going to wait," Solana said, setting the display slate on an empty oil drum. "They've registered the transport ship for planetary departure in 3 days. If you aren't on the ramp, they're going to restriction lock your lineage records in the Springfield Vault archive." The silence that followed was different from the silence in the geode hall. It was packed with the smell of wet earth and the sharp bite of hot iron. Gavin watched Silex's secondary eyes tilt downward toward the dirt floor, his claws tightening around the wooden mallet handle until the old pinewood groaned under the pressure. The personal pride of a high smith had breached its first boundary. The threat was no longer about a failed calculation, it was about who owned the work. "We go to Duluth then," Mike said, pulling his spectacles down to wipe off a speck of soot with his thumb. "The regional blade show starts on Friday. We put the thing on the table and let them look at it before your ship leaves." They loaded the truck on Thursday night under a cold, spitting sleet that turned the highway into a black mirror. The blade, which they had named Kamurai after an old Vormark phrase meaning born of 2 fires, was sealed inside an old wooden rifle case packed with grease-stained shop towels. Gavin drove, his eyes fixed on the yellow lines of the road, while Silex sat in the passenger seat with his long canvas cloak tucked tight around his secondary limbs to clear the gear shift. The Duluth exhibition hangar was a converted shipping warehouse right on the edge of the lake, its corrugated iron walls groaning as the freezing wind off Superior slammed into the bay doors. The interior was crowded with rows of folding tables, smelling of stale coffee, damp wool, and the vinegar tang of old-treated leather. There were hand-forged axes, hunting knives made from old saw blades, and pocket knives with handles carved from deer bone. Silex carried the wooden case with his lower arms, his upper limbs folded across his chest mantle as he walked down the narrow aisles. His silver breathing tubes drew in the cold air with a heavy, rattling hiss that made the smiths at the nearby tables stop their conversations, their eyes tracking the 7-foot Vrithrak as he moved past their displays. "That's some big machinery," a man in a red baseball cap muttered, leaning over a row of rustic hatchets. "Did he bring that thing from the rail yard?" Gavin didn't answer. He helped Silex set the case on their designated table at the back of the room, right beneath a flickering halogen light that hummed like a dead circuit. Silex unlocked the brass latches one by one, his fingers slow and deliberate as he pulled back the greasy towels to reveal the finished blade. The steel didn't have the polished silver mirror shine of the alien sheets back in the geode. It was dark, almost black, the surface covered in an intricate fluid wave pattern that looked like a deep river current caught in a midwinter freeze. Where the light hit the edge, a faint, smoky gray grain shimmered beneath the surface, the lines twisting around each other with a complexity that no zero-point computer could have coded. The judges began their rounds at noon, three old men in matching blue jackets carrying brass calipers and magnifying loops. The leader of the group was a retired toolmaker from the Iron Range, his fingers short and gnarled from 50 years of factory labor. He stopped in front of the Vance table, his eyes squinting through his bifocals as he looked at Camerai. "What's the carbon base on this?" the old man asked, his hand reaching out to touch the heavy spine. He didn't look at Silex, he looked at Mike, who was leaning against the warehouse wall with his arms crossed over his flannel shirt. "Old rail spikes from the crossing," Mike said, his voice low, "mixed with some stone he brought down from the high shelf, folded about 300 times before we let it cool in the tank." The judge didn't use his calipers. He picked up the knife by the wooden grip, his calloused thumb running along the bevel with a light, practiced pressure that left a tiny line of white skin on his thumbprint. He stood perfectly still for 11 seconds, his face expressionless as he checked the balance against his pointer finger. Then from the center of the blade, a low, clear hum began to echo through the hangar. It wasn't the sound of an energy field or a power cell. It was the harmonic frequency of the steel itself, rising and falling with every blast of the wind against the warehouse roof. The smiths from 3 rows over stopped their grinding wheels, the sudden silence spreading across the concrete floor until the only sound left was the steady, metallic jingle of the tool racks along the wall. The judge laid the knife back on the black suede cloth. He looked at Silex's silver breathing tubes, then at the grease smudges on the high master's canvas apron, his mouth pulling into a tight line that looked almost like a scar. "The edge doesn't have a roll," the old man said, his voice dropping until it was barely audible beneath the hum of the halogen bulb. "But the registry down in Chicago says this weapon doesn't match any known tariff code. Someone from the transport authority is waiting by the front office with a restriction order." Silex stepped forward, his massive gray shoulders blocking out the light from the corridor as his primary claws rested on the edge of the display table. "The document does not have a signature from the geode," Silex said, his translator box rattling against his chest plates as he pointed a long finger toward the front exit. "The authority in Chicago can wait for the final test. We are not clearing the table until the 3rd round is logged." The transport official, a short man in a black nylon jacket with an embassy badge pinned to the pocket, did not draw a weapon. He pulled a yellow digital stylus from his sleeve and held it against the wooden case. "The restriction order is automatic, sir. The material contains non-registered mineral elements from a protected sector. If the human co-entrant does not surrender the blank now, the vessel in orbit will lock your travel credit before midnight." Mike didn't move from his spot by the pillar. He reached out and picked up a paper cup of lukewarm water from the judge's table, taking a slow sip before setting it down exactly in the center of a grease stain. Then he looked at Gavin. "The edge is ready," Mike said, his voice dropping below the whine of the warehouse fans. "Give him the rope." Gavin reached into the bottom of the aluminum trunk, pulling out a 3-inch length of thick hemp rope that had been soaked in salt water to harden the fibers. He threw it across the display table, the heavy cords landing with a wet thud against the black suede. The crowd of smiths pressed closer, their breath forming white plumes in the unheated air of the hangar. No one spoke. The short official with the yellow stylus looked at the rope, then at the dark, smoking waves on Camerai's blade, his fingers shifting against his coat zipper. Silex did not use 3 hands for the strike. He used his primary right arm alone, his fingers wrapping around the wooden grip where the crooked brass pin sat flat against his palm. He did not bring the blade down with a shout or a heavy rush of air. The motion was short, a single measured sweep that followed the natural curve of the bevel. The rope split into 2 clean halves before the spine of the knife had even passed the center of the cord. The cut was perfectly smooth, without a single loose fiber or frayed strand on the grain. A small girl in a blue scarf, standing 3 rows back behind the heavy grinding benches, leaned over her father's shoulder to see the split wood beneath the hemp. Her name was Lily, and she had spent 3 hours watching the older men sharpen their hunting axes with heavy files, but she had never seen an edge that didn't leave scale on the table. The silence that followed was total. No warning, no declaration, no mercy. The triad of the strike hit the room like a cold drop from the geode arches. The translator box on Silex's belt didn't emit a single bell tone. The single-pitch grate had died when the blade finished its sweep, leaving only the quiet, rhythmic whistle of his silver neck tubes in the freezing air. The embassy official lowered his yellow stylus. The green status light on his marker turned a dull, blinking amber, the tracking code on his screen dropping into an unverified category that didn't connect to the Chicago registry. He didn't sign the restriction order. He tucked the plastic casing back into his nylon sleeve, turned toward the double doors, and walked out into the spitting sleet without looking back at the table. "The registry will note the exception," Silex said, his voice rough and unlayered as he laid the knife back on the suede cloth. "The human method has no code for extraction. It stays on the wood." The old toolmaker judge didn't offer a gold medal or a ribbon. He reached into his blue jacket pocket, pulled out a small piece of gray stone, a simple natural sharpening slip from the old iron range, and laid it beside Camerai's wooden handle. "It's yours," the judge said to Mike. "The wolf-tooth knife took the primary ribbon for the bonework, but this one stays in the ledger." By Saturday morning, the truck was idling outside the departure terminal in Minneapolis, its tailpipe sending thick clouds of white exhaust into the frozen gray sky. Silex stood by the glass baggage ramp, his long canvas travel cloak covered in grease smudges from the return trip through the mud ruts. He didn't have his silver measuring stylus. The device sat on the dashboard of Mike's truck, its digital display cracked from an old drop by the well pump. Gavin reached into his denim jacket pocket and pulled out the old iron screwdriver, the grease-stained tool handle cold against his palm. He didn't hand it over as a gift. He used the flat head to tighten the small brass screws on Silex's secondary waste tank, ensuring the oxygenated plasma line didn't rattle during the orbital ascent. "The air in the geode will taste different now," Gavin said, his boots crunching on the packed snow by the curb. "It will taste of carbon," Silex rasped, his secondary claws reaching instinctively for the wooden handle of a push broom that wasn't there. "The apprentices will complain about the scale on the floor. They will ask for the automated filters." "Tell them to start by sweeping the corners," Gavin said. The High Master turned toward the boarding ramp, his massive gray shoulders hunched beneath the low framework of the human terminal. He didn't turn back to look at the truck or the old man sitting in the passenger seat with his hands tucked into his flannel sleeves. The transport ship above the clouds was already shifting its resonance fields, the faint, purple static from the orbital drive weaving through the gray sleet like veins of furious thought. Gavin walked back to the driver's side, his fingers cold as he gripped the steering wheel. On the passenger seat right next to the cracked stylus lay a thin sheet of alloy folded into a tight origami square. The mark on the parchment was fresh, pressed deep into the metal by a primary claw that had learned how to hold an ashwood handle without slipping. The text beneath the mark was written in both English and Vrithrak glyphs, listing an open-loop entry code for the Springfield Vault archive that would remain live until the winter cycle aligned. The forge back in the backyard would be cold by 5 o'clock. The pine mulch by the fence was already freezing solid under the sleet, turning the scrap pile into a single gray mound that looked like stone from the highway. Gavin put the truck in gear, his eyes tracking the yellow lines of the road as the wind off the lake began to rattle the loose aluminum latches of the empty rifle case in the back bed. He did not file the sheet, the mark faced up,